Good evening or good afternoon. Welcome to everyone, to our faculty, to our associates, to our donors, to our emeriti, to our postdocs, to our graduate students, to all of you friends. As usual, the annual PEEPS lecture and feast is a moment to reflect on things we have done in the year past. And the last time we saw each other was April 1st, which was no joke. But now, it's not a full year, it's 11 months. I'll explain in a moment why it's only 11 months. In any case, as most of you know, I'm sure actually all of you know, the core mission of the CMRS Center for Early Global Studies since 2021 has been to make the study of the early global the focus of our methodology and comparison, to open up to all disciplines. Why? And all, of course, the whole world. Why? Because the only way to think of the future differently is to think of the past differently. And so within that scope, we have been running since 2023 our Mellon-funded project, Race in the Global Past Through Native Lenses, which has brought UCLA native and non-native faculty, students, staff, associates and postdocs together with community members of the LA-based Tongva tribe and also Central and South American LA communities. And one of our postdoctoral fellows is present here, Daniel Gomez, and I'm very happy to report that he has just gotten his tenure-track job offer at UC Davis. So we will be keeping him in the University of California. Now, with this grant, CMRS SEGS reaffirms and acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Our second program that we have been running, that some of you may be familiar with, is the John W. Baldwin postdoctoral program, thanks to a generous gift that focuses on what broadly described, I say, is Europe in the world. And our inaugural Baldwin postdoc, Basil Price, got a tenure-track position at SUNY Oneonta, so we're very proud of him. And we have just selected our second postdoctoral fellow, Julia Giamboni. She will be joining us on July 1st this year, and we certainly hope that the postdoc program will have the same success and procure another tenure-track position for a young researcher. And I am also very happy to report that it looks like we will be successful in renewing our Mellon grant for another 3 years. So look out for the news on that. Now, you all know that these are the projects that are very, very important to me. I have made them the core of my mission as director, but I want to say that SEGS is a community and a model to other research centers, as our review last year pointed out. Other research centers across the continent, not because just there is a singular vision, but because there is a collective effort. And tonight, I wanted to take an opportunity to thank so many of our faculty and our associates who make it possible to have SEGS the way it is, to be this community and to be this model for all research centers who focus on medieval and Renaissance, early modern, late antiquity that are out there in the world. And I first want to thank our publications branch that has truly become a force in early global studies. We have our 5.5-decade-old and very renowned journal, Viator, that has been led very successfully by Matthew Fisher, professor in English, who is here tonight with us. Our book series editor, Jamie Kreiner, who is professor in Wellman Chair in History, also with us tonight. She is leading the book series Cursor Mundi. And they both share an incredible editorial committee. I want to thank Javier Patiño Loira, Roberta Morosini, Pete Stacy, Erica Weaver, and Bronwyn Wilson, and Luke Yarborough for their incredible work, bringing around these journals and making sure that they represent our center in the best possible way out there in the world. And on that note, I'm very pleased to report that we have another renowned journal that we have just acquired, and that is Manuscripta. with its new editor-in-chief, Devin Fitzgerald, who is curator of global book history and history of printing at UCLA Library. So we now have 3 journals, Viator, Manuscripta, and of course, Comitatus, our graduate student and early career researcher journal that is run by a graduate student editorial board. All of this aided and abetted by our extraordinary managing editor, Alison McCann, who is somewhere back there. Now, 2 of our 3 longest running programs are run by our incredible faculty and associates. History of the Book lecture series that started back in 1993. The Richard and Mary Rouse History of the Book lecture series that is run by those I've already mentioned, Matthew, Luke, Devin, but also Elizabeth Morrison, Senior Curator of Manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum, who is one of our longest associates, and until recently, Lamia Balafresh. The California Medieval Seminar, the second longest. Well, actually not quite true. I'm going to give you a quiz at the end of this. It began in 1995, is now open explicitly to all the disciplines because it used to be called California History, Medieval History Seminar. It is run by a committee of SEGS associates only. Tom Barton, who is at the University of San Diego, Heather Blurton at UC Santa Barbara, Rowan Doran at Stanford, and Alison Perchuk at California State Channel Islands. So you can see the breadth and the scope. We cover all of California, and they're a stellar committee, and 3 of the 4 have won prestigious awards and recognitions from the Medieval Academy of America in the last 2 years in the form of book awards or election to the Fellow Society. So that they're a wonderful, just a wonderful steering committee. As director, I am aided in every aspect by a fantastic faculty advisory board. I will spare you the names. You are free to go on that one. But I also want to thank my associate director, who will be here with us tonight, Una Paredes, who is in Asian languages and cultures, and who has been an incredible support in grant and publication aspects of the center's work. In fact, the center is so tentacular. You know, I could go on for another 15 minutes, but I think we do want to hear Molly Warsh tonight, right? It's so tentacular that I really failed to mention so many things that we do. But what is for sure is that all the things that we do could not be done without support, not just faculty support that I've just mentioned and associate support, but also the leadership from our dean, Alexandra Stern, who is with us tonight, who has been fantastic in recognizing the center's expanded role and research mission success. And from the ground up, of course, my staff. None of this would happen without the staff. I've already mentioned Alison McCann, but also Shufeng Deng, Thi Nguyen, Santera Palmer, Alejandra Quiroz Gonzalez, and of course, the Chief Administrative Officer, who is now Vivian Hollenbeck, back there. Thank you, Viv. Thank you, Viv, for stepping into this role as interim CAO, for doing a spectacular job, balancing 2 jobs at the same time, having replaced our wonderful Karen Burgess, who is here with us tonight. More about Karen later. Okay, now the quiz. What is the 3rd, and in fact, the oldest program that the center has run? Now let me think. Why are we here? Beeps, there we go. Yes, this is our 3rd longest running and the most, and the oldest. So we are gathered here today thanks to William and Lois Matthews Endowment. William Matthews was a member of the English department and the center's 2nd director. The endowment directs us to hold the center's annual lecture and also a festive dinner, I quote, whenever possible on the same date, March 26, that Samuel Pepys held his great feast for celebrating his cure from cutting of the stone. Thankfully, the gift agreement is flexible because March 26 will never happen. Why? It's our spring break. Hence, we meet today on March 2nd. Last year, we met on April 1st. Our speaker tonight is Molly Warsh, Associate Professor of History at the University of Pittsburgh. She's the editor of the Journal of Early Modern History and the director of the Alliance for Learning in World History, a consortium of educators and history scholars organized to advance the teaching and learning of world history in classrooms in the US and globally. While she completed her PhD in Atlantic history at Johns Hopkins, she then held positions at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture in Virginia, and then in Iberian World History at Texas A&M University, finally moving to the University of Pittsburgh in 2012 into the field of world history. She is the author of American Baroque, Pearls and the Nature of Empire. She also co-edited an anthology of essays titled Early North America and Global Perspective, and she has held multiple national and international fellowships, including at the Huntington, and her award-winning articles have appeared in the William and Mary Quarterly, Slavery and Abolition, and Environmental History. And tonight, her talk is titled Breedlings, quote, and the quote, most said fens, Perceptions of Untameable Places and People in Samuel Pepys, England. Welcome to Molly Warsh, and thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I am going to even set my timer because I would hate to stand between us and the festive meal that will follow this, although it should not be a problem. I would like to first begin by thanking Zrinka Stahuliak and the entire team at the Center for Early Global Studies for inviting me here tonight. I would also like to thank Thi Nguyen and Santara Palmer for helping to organize and publicize this talk. The title of my lecture is Breedlings and the Most Sad Fens, Perceptions of Untameable Places and People in Samuel Pepys's England. And I will indeed talk about this, but I will also talk about more than this. I left off a critical part of the sentence in my original title, which is fixed here. It should have been in Pepys's England and beyond. As an historian trained in the intersection of Iberian and British empires, I would never claim to be a Pepys expert, although he and his wife do appear in my first book, American Baroque, on the early modern pearl trade. As Pepys noted purchasing increasingly expensive pearl necklaces for Elizabeth as his career as a naval administrator flourished in the 1660s. Here she is wearing pearls, although not the necklaces, but still pearl earrings. I have returned to Pepys as I work on my current project titled Servants of the Seasons, Migration, Reproduction, and Place in the Early Atlantic World. This new book explores life within and perceptions of landscapes I'm calling liminal, a word derived from the Latin limen, meaning threshold, and their multi-species inhabitants. What threat and allure did these places hold? Liminal spaces were sites of creation as well as of dissolution for people, animals, ecologies, and empires in the 16th and 17th centuries. The ecological ebb and flow of life in these places shaped outsiders' perceptions of them. They were often viewed as breeding grounds for culturally subversive practices on scales small and large. They were places that produced and reproduced people and lifeways that undermined the politics and aspirations of expanding polities. Although seasonal mobility in the early modern Atlantic world and beyond was frequently, if not always, correlated with human labor and the ambitions of governing powers, the timing and nature of human displacement was often motivated and constrained by patterns generated in the non-human world. I'm particularly interested in how human and non-human seasonal lifeways intersected in these liminal ecological zones. My research thus far suggests that in the early modern era, people often looked across the species line for insight into the meaning and impact of enduring associations with these spaces. The early modern histories of fens, seashores, or mangrove swamps, all places that we will visit over the course of this talk, ask us to consider both ecological realities and cultural tropes. These sites can be considered liminal from an ecological perspective, and were often also considered by some early modern contemporaries as culturally liminal, although the inhabitants of said spaces, whether they were living in Brazilian mangrove swamps or English fens, rarely, if ever, saw them that way. I'm not sure how useful the term liminal will prove in the long run as this project develops. I have been cautioned against how it might reproduce European biases that inform the designation of certain people and places as marginal or existing on the threshold of a narrowly defined humanity, rather than recognizing the centrality of these landscapes and their cultures of resource management. This danger is particularly keen when it comes to the history of mangroves. The Portuguese word mangue is a Senegambian Wolof word in origin, and as many scholars have shown, mangroves were central to complex systems of West African and later American cultures of subsistence. So, I may abandon the term liminal going forward, but for now, I continue to find it useful to think about particular multi-species ecological spaces and contemporary early modern views of the cultural generation and degeneration that occurred therein. Environmental history has always intersected with social history, and this nexus is at the heart of my current work. The field of environmental history has long skewed modern and male, but there are signs that this is changing. Recent works reveal diverse scholars looking across the species line to explore everything from changing ideas about sex, race, and class, to the implications of migration for social and biological reproduction. In the maelstrom of the changing world of the 16th and 17th centuries, the domination of non-human nature of all types was, of course, central to the ambitions of emerging empires. It is hard enough to recover the ways in which particular ecologies shaped early modern human experiences of seasonality and temporary migration. Thinking precisely about non-human experiences of the same is harder still. To take non-human histories seriously requires historians to do more than read against the grain. It requires a move out of the archives and into other modalities of learning and communicating. In the words of literary scholar Pablo Mukherjee, quote, "It is precisely because distinct species cannot meet in language that we have to think about other ways to tell stories." In thinking about the fens as a multi-species landscape and a particular cultural zone, I have sought out other ways of storytelling beyond academic history and the records of archives. This includes visiting and taking in the landscapes that interest me. As I have begun to work on England's vast and rich marshlands, a landscape of some 700,000 acres in the early modern period, spread out across east, central, and southward England, I have consulted the work of the dedicated ecologists caring for and explaining the history of the fens. Let's go back one. And we'll just look at these for a moment. These are my own photos from a trip there last year, and I don't know how many of you have been to the fens, but it's a really stark landscape. It is exactly as described, watery, marshy. This was winter, so it was particularly bleak and evocative. It is a land of ghost stories, and as I will tell in a few minutes, it was demonized in this period as the target of great state-sponsored drainage projects. There's tremendous support now in England for restoring the marshlands, and really, really wonderful ecologists working to restore these complex ecologies. This is an example of a native technology for catching eels, which is one of the central resources of the fens, beautifully made with reeds inserted so the eels, once they swim in, can't escape. So it's not only visiting the landscapes that has been inspirational, I have taken in as well the evocative language of novels set in these landscapes, which I highly recommend, such as The Peregrine by J.A. Baker, Graham Swift's Waterland, Stella Tilliard's The Great Level, and Rachel Cusk's Second Place. I'm sure there are more. The fens and their contested early modern history are what led me back to Pepys. When Pepys wrote, the fens were at the center of a prolonged struggle to transform England's rich wetland into enclosed and largely privately owned arable land, a project that had its roots in the 16th century, and after a flurry of activity in the 1630s and 1650s, received a new and more effective burst of royal support in the 1660s, coinciding with Pepys's rise as a naval administrator. The saga of the drainage of the fens in the 17th century has been well chronicled by excellent historians such as Eric Ashe and James Boyce. More terrific scholars such as Kate Luce-Mulry, William Cavert, and Ellie Robeson-Desauteaux continue to produce illuminating scholarship on the ecological and social histories of the fens and England's environmental history more broadly. I can only hope to contribute to this rich world of England-focused scholarship on the fens' early modern history by bringing an Atlantic and global perspective to the fights over these spaces, considering them in the context of related early modern conversations about ecologically and culturally potent zones elsewhere. Indeed, my goal in tonight's talk is to immerse you in these watery places, including the fens. I will then consider Pepys's observations of this contested landscape and its inhabitants in 1663, coincidentally the year in which Charles II sponsored the reformed Bedford Corporation, led by engineers determined to drain the fens once and for all, in the context of shifting early modern ideas about how certain wild places functioned as socially and biologically suspect breeding grounds. But first, let's travel back in time a little bit to late April or early May of 1565, in a liminal space far to England's south, the southwestern Atlantic coast of Spain. Each year, in the late spring, there comes a point when the fierce eastern wind, known as the Levante, gives way to the warmer wind that blows in from the south across the Strait of Gibraltar. This is often still called the viento de atunes, the tuna wind, because it heralds the arrival of schools of enormous bluefin tuna who have crossed the Atlantic and reached the final stretch of their journey. If they are lucky, they will cross the Strait of Gibraltar and enter the Mediterranean to spawn, but many do not make it. For thousands of years, continuing to the present, fishermen have gathered along the shores of southwestern Iberia to await the fish and capture them in a practice known as the almadraba, which is a Hispano-Arabic word meaning place of struggle or blows. As early modern religious, secular, and visual accounts demonstrate, the almadraba fascinated early modern observers not only as a maritime cultural landscape characterized by extraordinary and lucrative battles between fish and humans, but also as a seasonal encounter that illuminated distinct and gendered cross-species modalities of maritime migration and reproduction. Biological and social imperatives, drove the yearly carnival of the almadraba. As the bluefin followed ocean currents in pursuit of reproduction each spring, local grandees affirmed their political and economic power through their oversight of the yearly tuna harvest and control over its profits. The precise temporality of bluefin migration was a source of fascination to observers. Jesuits ministering in the fisheries admiringly observed the reproductive calendar that drove bluefin's yearly transoceanic journey, often comparing their behavior with humans and other animals. The seasonal laborers who harvested the tuna, however, drew the missionaries' condemnation. Their impressions of almadraba workers, particularly the women among them, were scathing. Whereas the Jesuits described the tuna as noble and awe-inspiring, the laborers largely provoked disgust and concern in the missionaries. While the spring pilgrimage of the bluefin from one ocean basin to another served a compelling reproductive purpose, the itinerant laborers who flooded the tuna towns each spring offered an opposite spectacle. Unlike the spawning tuna, the seasonal workers did not generate anything but trouble. They were degenerates who fell prey to their worst impulses in the fisheries, with the men turning to gambling and the women to prostitution. In contrast to the bluefin's reproductive journey from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, which begot fish and transformed the egg-bearing tuna from fat to thin, the itinerancy of the almadraba workers served only to reproduce their poverty. So what did this spectacle look like in the 16th and 17th centuries? Vivid accounts of the early modern almadraba reveal how thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, of attention to the tides, temperatures, winds, currents, birds above the water and waters below, dictated when the fishermen would cross the shoreline and make their way to the boats to await the fish. As the sun rose, the men would keep their eyes trained on the towers that dotted the shore, from which expert spotters watched for the approaching schools of fish, alerted to their arrival by changes in the churn and color of the waves. When these eagle-eyed observers spotted the telltale perturbation of the water, the movements of their flags alerted the men in the boats that the time had come and the tuna would soon be beneath them. Suspended underwater from the boats arrayed in an arc were elaborate systems of nets woven by local women. This underwater labyrinth would entrap the panicked and disoriented fish. For most of the tuna in the submerged maze, their cold, long journey across the Atlantic had come to a terrifying end. Hearts pounding, the fishermen in the boats would try to keep from capsizing while waiting for the opportunity to land a blow on the fish with a rock. Others stood naked in the water, carrying thick clubs affixed with sharp, sturdy hooks, which they sought to embed in the frantic, enormous tuna. This was an act of precise and high-stakes violence. Too little force as the fishermen inserted the hook, and the bluefin would escape wounded, perhaps dragging the men underwater. If he inserted the hook in the wrong part of the tuna's body, its flesh would be damaged and its worth on the market vastly diminished, to the detriment of the local grandees who managed the seasonal spectacle and the populace who depended on its profits. When the blow landed correctly and the tuna was hooked, the next stage of the drama would begin. Shouts would go up. This was the sign for the day laborers waiting in the shallows and on the shore, the poor men who made the seasonal pilgrimage to the tuna towns, offering their muscle in exchange for cash and carousing, to seize the ropes affixed to the hook sunk deep into the fish's body. Thigh deep in bloody water, these ventureros, as they were known, strained to haul the wounded bluefin onto the sand. Flailing on the shoreline, the powerful creature's death throes beat deep trenches into the sand. As the ventureros headed back into the water to repeat the process, more expert hands affixed the lifeless bluefin onto a cart to be hauled away for processing, its flesh transformed into profit. In and out of the water, the tuna, like the female weavers of nets, the donkeys that hauled the carts, the fishermen, the spotters high in their towers, the butchers, the ventureros, were all immersed in a multi-species ritual of social, biological, and economic reproduction. Roughly 75 years after the heights of the tuna harvests in the mid-16th century, the famous Portuguese cosmographer, João Teixeira Albernaz I, sat down at his desk in Lisbon to reproduce Portugal's claims to a distant American land. With rich hues and precise lines, he crossed a vast ocean with his pen and paints, bringing this world into view. The colony whose coastline he rendered in browns and greens, Brazil, was already over a century old, an increasingly wealthy and familiar part of the evolving Atlantic Americas. It was claimed by Portugal, but inhabited largely by indigenous peoples and increasingly by Africans and their descendants. The exquisite detail with which Teixeira depicted the colony's coastline deflected attention from just how much about this vast land and its inhabitants remained unknown. As Teixeira drew, the Quilombo of Palmares, located in the interior of the captaincy of Pernambuco in the modern state of Alagoas, continued to grow as an independent settlement of self-emancipated peoples fleeing the violence of the Portuguese colonial state. But it was not only the interior that provided a haven for those who sought to live beyond the lines that Teixeira drew on behalf of the Portuguese. Along the Brazilian littoral, endless stretches of mangroves provided another imperfect home to tenacious creatures and humans who could figure out how to live with and from them. In the late 16th century, the Portuguese Jesuit Fernão Cardim noted the centrality of the usá crab, which thrived in mangroves, to the Brazilian diet, writing that the crab was, quote, the sustenance of all this land, particularly of the Guinea slaves and Indians, unquote. They were complicated political ecologies, these mangrove settlements, and Teixeira suggested as much in his rendering of the Bay of All Saints, near the Ilha de Taparica in the modern state of Bahia. Let me advance this. The clues to a coastal geography of confusion, a disconcerting space neither fully land nor fully sea, are found in Teixeira's labeling of the smaller islands near Taparica. Some vague names, several ilhas alagadizas or marshlands, islands cobertas de mangues, covered in mangroves, and most intriguingly, a fear island. Let me see if I can point it out. Over here. A fear island, Ilha do Medo. Fear of what? Fear of whom? The alligators, the mosquitoes, the flooding, or of the people? Perhaps those who once labored on the nearby sugar plantations, the engenhos, that Teixeira also depicts, that are on the islands over here, the island of Taparica, who fled to this coastal forest that was part haven, part hell. Rich in shellfish and crabs to harvest and eat, the mangroves also housed deadly amphibians and insects, lesser evils, many deemed, than the horrors of the sugar plantation or the endless poverty of the landless poor, to use historian Sean Miller's term. Whose fear was it then that Teixeira invoked with his careful labeling of the island in the bay? Teixeira's map asks us to immerse ourselves in the watery borders of the evolving early modern Atlantic world and to consider how these were generative and degenerative spaces, depending on your perspective. At almost the exact same time as Teixeira drew, struggles over how to control a different watery landscape erupted across the marshy fenlands of East Central England. Pepys was just 10 at the time, but the struggles over fen enclosure and drainage that were unfolding during his childhood would come flooding back during his adulthood. For as long as modernizing projectors, as they were known, elite men with varying degrees of royal support, attempted to privatize and drain England's wetlands, residents of the low-lying, seasonally flooding fens fought back as best they could. When their legal efforts failed, they didn't hesitate to seek out other ways of sabotaging the projectors' plans. Let's consider one instance from the 1640s. On the morning of May 15th, 1643, the sound of tolling bells traveled across the still surface of Whittlesea Mere, a long, shallow inland lake about 40 miles from England's largest estuary system, known as the Warsh. The ringing of the bells normally signaled a flood warning, but that was not the case on this particular day. Instead, the bells were a call to arms to local villagers, increasingly frustrated by attempts to enclose the more than 7,000 acres of the Mere's surrounding wetlands, which would deprive residents of access to the rich and complex ecosystem that sustained them. That morning, in response to the bells, a large group gathered in their shared commons under the guise of inspecting the boundary of the fens where they usually caught wildfowl. Their real purpose was to disrupt drainage works. Over the next several days, women and men alike took aim at the newly built ditches and embankments that sought to contain and channel the waters which seasonally enriched the landscape. The water and silt brought in by the yearly floods were essential to the interlinked lifeways of the region's human and non-human inhabitants. Many non-native observers viewed the human residents of this unique watery landscape as less than human, an amphibious race, whose facility with stilts and poles and flat-bottomed watercraft was suspicious and unnatural. These are from a later period, but give you an idea of these enduring technologies of moving around the fens. To many outsiders, the fens were a sickly and unappealing environment plagued by brackish water and deadly insects. Fenlanders themselves, however, saw things differently. They violently fought the French and Dutch Protestant laborers brought to the fens by sponsors of the drainage projects. These religious refugees were tasked with building the dikes that drained the land and enclosing what was once common. Fenlanders would have none of these migrants or the improvements they tried to build into and onto the landscape. The Fenlanders fought with the means they had available. They hurled rocks at the agents of drainage and enclosure. They unleashed their cows and horses to trample upon newly planted corn and the crop once known as coalseed, now known as rape, the harbingers of the agricultural transformations that the sponsors of the drainage project hoped to see. The Fenlanders welcomed the seasonal waters that England's reforming projectors deemed pestilential and destructive. The residents filled ditches and drains with dirt to facilitate the yearly winter and spring floods that rendered their marshy landscape so fertile. As they sought to protect the wetlands' yearly immersion, Fenlanders found themselves immersed in the early modern politics of improvement, migration, and imperial expansion at home and abroad. As I began to think about the history of England's fens and the violently contested drainage projects of the early modern period, I turned to Pepys's diary to see if he had anything to say about this controversial world of wetlands. He had a lot to say about a lot, as we all know. He did not disappoint in this instance either. I will turn to these entries in a moment, but before I do so, I would like to acknowledge that my understanding of Pepys and my analysis of his entries on the English fens and their inhabitants have been transformed by recent scholarship on the diary by English scholar Kate Loveman. In her remarkable, moving 2025 book, The Strange History of Samuel Pepys's Diary, Loveman is exceptionally compelling on the importance of understanding how his legacy has been shaped by editorial choices and the political contexts in which different editions of his diary appeared. She is forthright about her own interest in, quote, aspects of the diary that readers have historically not recognized or preferred not to discuss. Chief among these are the records of Pepys's enjoyment of sexual violence and his references to his growing interest and involvement in the slave trade. As with questions of editorial censorship, investigating this content and responses to it reveals changing perceptions of history and of whose experiences count as valuable, unquote. Loveman's injunction that, quote, to take Pepys seriously means taking other lives seriously, and in the process recognizing other histories as meaningful and intriguing as his, echoed in my brain as I read his descriptions of his trip to the Fens. So, on that note, let's consider Pepys's accounts of the mucky, malarial fens and their inhabitants. Pepys's descriptions echo, in less dramatic, slightly less demeaning terms than those of contemporary sponsors of the drainage projects. One of these writers characterized the region and its residents in terms that are strikingly reminiscent of Jesuits' descriptions of seasonal tuna fisher laborers, writing that Fenlanders were, quote, half fish, half flesh, for they drink like fishes and sleep like hogs, and if the men be such creatures, judge what their women be. A way of undermining Fenlanders' sustained, cogent political resistance to enclosure was to link their threat to the English body politic to Fenlanders' own bodies and the multi-species watery world they called home. The year that Pepys traveled to the Fens to visit poor relatives and resolve a complex inheritance issue was not long after the Bedford Level Corporation regrouped to again tackle the draining of this region, which incidentally was not really solved or completed until the 19th century. Early attempts had failed despite repeated claims of success. Pepys emphasized the watery nature of this landscape, the threat that the land and the behavior of the people there posed to his animals. Horses sink in the mud or are stolen. The land is poor and heathenish. The people are wretched. He writes, Thursday, 17 September 1663. Up, and my father being gone to bed ill last night and continuing so this morning, I was forced to come to a new consideration, whether it was fit for to let my uncle and his son go to Wisbeck about my Uncle Day's estate alone or no, and concluded it unfit, and so resolved to go with them myself, leaving my wife there. I began a journey with them, and with much ado through the fens, along dikes, where sometimes we were ready to have our horses sink to the belly. We got by night, with great deal of stir and hard riding, to Parson's Drove, a heathen place, where I found my uncle and Aunt Perkins and their daughters, poor wretches, in a sad, poor, thatched cottage, like a poor barn or stable peeling of hemp, in which I did give myself good content to see their manner of preparing of hemp, and in a poor condition of habit took them to our miserable inn, and there, after long stay, and hearing of Frank, their son, the miller, play upon his treble, as he calls it, with which he earns part of his living, and singing of a country bawdy song, we sat down to supper, the whole crew, and Frank's wife and child, a sad company, of which I was ashamed, supped with us. And after supper, I, talking with my aunt about her report concerning my Uncle Day's will and surrender, I found her in such different reports from what she writes and says to the people, and short of what I expected, that I fear little will be done of good in it. By and by news is brought to us that one of our horses is stole out of the stable, which proves my uncle's, at which I am inwardly glad. I mean that it was not mine. And at this we were at a great loss. And they, doubting a person that lay at next door, a Londoner, some lawyer's clerk, we caused him to be secured in his bed, and other care to be taken to seize the horse. And so about 12 at night or more, to bed, in a sad, cold, nasty chamber. Only the maid was indifferent handsome, so I had a kiss or two of her, and I to bed. And a little after I was asleep, they waked me to tell me that the horse was found, which was good news, and so to sleep till the morning, but was bit cruelly, and nobody else of our company, which I wonder at, by the gnats. Aside from attention to hemp, from which sailcloth could be made, an interest of England's as the Navy largely brought hemp-made sailcloth from the Dutch, and Pepys in his naval administrator capacity would have paid close attention to this, the fens, in Pepys' accounting, were defined by base nature and base behavior, the bawdy song, the stealing of a horse, and of course, Pepys' own base behavior, having a kiss or two of the maid, a very Pepys-like euphemism for an act of forced intimacy. Pepys' comments are not far off from those of Bedford Level Corporation investor Samuel Fortree, who, when writing a celebratory account of the drainage project in the mid-1680s, condemned the Fenlanders as being, quote, little better than animals with dull wits, led only by unthinking, bestial sensation or passion, not by civilized reason. The next day, Pepys continued to report on his visit to these most sad fens. He wrote, Friday, 18 September, 1663. Up and got our people together as soon as we could, and after eating a dish of cold cream, which was my supper last night too, we took leave of our beggarly company, though they seemed good people too, and over most sad fens, all the way observing the sad life which the people of the place, which if they be born there, they do call the breedlings of the place, do live, sometimes rowing from one spot to another, and then wading to Wisbeck, a pretty town, and a fine church and library, where sundry very old abbey manuscripts and a fine house, built on the church ground by Secretary Thurlow, and a fine gallery built for him in the church, but now all in the Bishop of Ely's hands. After visiting the church, etc., we went out of the town, by the help of a stranger, to find one Blinkhorn, a miller, of whom we might inquire something of old days' disposal of his estate, and in whose hands it now is. And by great chance we met him, and brought him to our inn to dinner. And instead of being informed in his estate by this fellow, we find that he is the next heir to the estate, which was matter of great sport to my cousin Thomas and me, to see such a fellow prevent us in our hopes, he being Day's brother's daughter's son, whereas we are but his sister's sons and grandsons. So that, after all, we were fain to propose our matter to him, and to get him to give us leave to look after the business, and so he to have 1/3 part, and we to have the other 2/3 parts, of what should be recovered to the estate, which he consented to. And after some discourse and paying the reckoning, we mounted again and rode, being very merry at our defeat, to Chatteris, my uncle very weary, and after supper and my telling of 3 stories to their good liking of spirits, we all 3 in a chamber went to bed. In this second description of the fens, we again see Pepys's emphasis on the fens as a degenerative landscape, reproducing its impoverished, culturally inferior inhabitants. The human residents of these sad fens are breedlings and beggarly, even if they are good people. As Kate Luce Mulry writes, quote, "In the early modern world, the generative qualities of particular landscapes and people were scrutinized." Unquote. The imperial was personal, and what is more personal than reproduction? It was also a landscape of tricksters and spirits. Pepys laughs at the futility of his estate hunt and finishes the day by telling ghost stories, in which, by the way, the fens did and do abound, and added to contemporary perceptions of them as a threatening landscape. Even though Pepys's comments on the fens are limited, they are revealing as another example of his social accounting, to use Mark Dawson's words. Even as he described his relatives with disdain, he offered a glimpse of the life of these cousins, their skill with a critical local resource, hemp, their comfort navigating the marshlands between their homes and the pretty village of Wisbeck, and assorted cultural treasures. Pepys's comments reveal a view of the fens and their inhabitants as signifiers of decay, dissolution, unkempt lands, waters, and people, but also, of course, of their fecundity. They were the homes of politically savvy and unyielding breedlings, as well as nurseries for fish and fowl, and the source of other natural resources as well, such as the hemp Pepys noted. These places of ebbs and flows, such as the fens, the Atlantic mangrove swamps, or the shorelines of southwestern Spain, generated enduring and elusive multi-species communities that challenged the grasp of the expanding imperial state in a variety of ways. In a work of eco-criticism on the history of the fens and their role in shaping Shakespeare's Tempest, literary scholar T.A. Borlick notes that the struggles over the fens in England were, quote, about the colonization of peoples in their land, but also, on a deeper level, the colonization of non-human nature itself by anthropocentric science, unquote. It is my hope that a study of these particular liminal ecologies and the multi-species lifeways that characterize them in the early modern period will provide new insights into how human and non-human nature informed evolving ideas about what it meant to move, live, and labor, to generate and degenerate across the Atlantic world. Thank you.